The world held its breath. The Cold War cast a long dark shadow across the globe. It was a time of fear and uncertainty. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a struggle for dominance. Both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons. The threat of annihilation hung heavy in the air. In this atmosphere of paranoia, secrecy became paramount. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain engaged in clandestine operations. They sought every advantage. Scientific advancements were. The world held its breath. The Cold War cast a long dark shadow across the globe. It was a time of fear and uncertainty. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a struggle for dominance. Both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons. The threat of annihilation hung heavy in the air. In this atmosphere of paranoia, secrecy became paramount. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain engaged in clandestine operations. They sought every advantage. Scientific advancements were pushed to the limit. Ethical boundaries were often blurred and sometimes completely disregarded. The United States, driven by a desire to surpass its rivals, embarked on a series of covert experiments. These tests were often conducted on unsuspecting citizens. The government justified these actions as necessary for national security. However, the truth remained hidden from the public eye. The chilling reality of these experiments would only come to light decades later. The quest for answers would uncover a disturbing chapter in American history. It was a chapter marked by government overreach, human experimentation, and a blatant disregard for the well-being of its own people. St. Louis, Missouri, a bustling city on the banks of the Mississippi River, became an unwitting participant in this dark chapter of the Cold War. In the 1950s, the city was chosen as the testing ground for a series of secret chemical experiments conducted by the U.S. Army. These experiments, shrouded in secrecy, would have devastating consequences for many of its residents. Under the cover of darkness, the Army targeted unsuspecting neighborhoods with a fine powder called zinc cadmium sulfide. This potentially carcinogenic substance was dispersed into the air. It settled on homes, cars, and playgrounds. Residents, unaware of the danger lurking in the air they breathed, went about their daily lives. The Army claimed these tests were harmless. They said they were simulating the dispersal of smoke screens. However, the truth was far more sinister. The St. Louis experiments were part of a larger program to develop biological weapons. The government wanted to see how effectively they could disperse these agents over a populated area. The residents of St. Louis, particularly those in low-income, predominantly black neighborhoods, were treated as guinea pigs. Their health and well-being were sacrificed in the name of national security. The long-term effects of exposure to zinc cadmium sulfide would not be fully understood for decades. The St. Louis experiments were not an isolated incident. In 1950, the city of San Francisco became the target of a similar, albeit even more audacious, biological warfare experiment known as Operation Sea Spray. This time, the weapon of choice was Serratia marcescens, a bacterium that can cause respiratory and urinary tract infections. The Navy, operating under a veil of secrecy, unleashed clouds of Serratia marcescens over the unsuspecting city. The bacteria were dispersed from a ship sailing along the San Francisco coastline. The wind carried the invisible threat inland, exposing hundreds of thousands of people. The government claimed the bacteria were harmless. They said it was a harmless simulant. However, the reality was far different. Many residents fell ill with flu-like symptoms. One man, Edward Nevin, died from a heart infection linked to the bacteria. The San Francisco experiment, like the St. Louis tests, revealed a disturbing truth about the government's willingness to use its own citizens as test subjects. The pursuit of scientific advancement and military superiority took precedence over the health and well-being of the American people. The government's experimentation with biological weapons extended beyond zinc cadmium sulfide and Serratia marcescens. In the 1970s, the U.S. Army conducted a series of anthrax experiments that would have terrifying implications. These experiments, shrouded in secrecy, were inspired by the work of Nazi scientists brought to the United States after World War II under the controversial Operation Paperclip. These Nazi scientists, once instrumental in the horrors of the Holocaust, were now working for the U.S. government. They continued their research into biological weapons. Their knowledge and expertise were seen as invaluable in the fight against communism. The ethical implications of employing former Nazi scientists were largely ignored. The Army's anthrax experiments were conducted at Fort Detrick in Maryland. They involved testing the effectiveness of various anthrax strains. They wanted to determine their lethality and potential as biological weapons. The experiments were conducted on animals, but the potential for accidental release and the devastating consequences of such an event were a constant concern. Section 5. Whispers in the Shadows, Secret Societies and Their Grip on Power. As the Cold War raged on, whispers of even darker forces at play began to circulate. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some believed that secret societies were pulling the strings behind the scenes. They orchestrated global events for their own nefarious purposes. These theories, often dismissed as the ramblings of madmen, gained traction among those who saw a hidden hand in the chaos of the world. One such theory pointed to the involvement of powerful elites who controlled the world's finances. These individuals, so the theory went, manipulated economies, instigated wars, and profited from the suffering of millions. Their ultimate goal was to establish a new world order, one in which they held absolute power. While evidence supporting these claims remained elusive, the rumors persisted. They thrived on the very real secrecy and deceit that characterized the Cold War era. The government's clandestine activities, coupled with the often unexplained events of the time, fueled speculation and mistrust. The line between fact and fiction became increasingly blurred. Section 6. The Price of Silence. Victims and their fight for justice. For decades, the victims of the government's secret experiments suffered in silence. Many were unaware that they had been exposed to harmful substances. Those who suspected a connection between their illnesses and the government's actions faced an uphill battle for recognition and justice. The government, for its part, denied any wrongdoing. It maintained that the experiments were conducted safely, and that any claims of harm were unfounded. The weight of the government's secrecy and the passage of time made it difficult for victims to prove their case. However, the truth has a way of surfacing. As the Cold War ended, and the grip of secrecy loosened, whistleblowers came forward. Documents were declassified. The government's lies began to unravel. Section 7. Unmasking the Truth Investigations and Revelations. The revelations of the government's secret experiments sent shockwaves through the nation. Congressional hearings were held. Journalists dug deeper into the story. The public was outraged that their government had conducted such unethical and potentially illegal experiments on its own citizens. Investigations revealed a pattern of deception and cover-ups. The government had deliberately misled the public about the nature and extent of its experiments. It had concealed evidence of harm to protect itself from liability. The investigations also exposed the role of private contractors in the government's clandestine activities. These companies, often operating with little oversight, were complicit in the government's abuses. They profited from the suffering of innocent people. Section 8. Echoes of the Past. The Long Road to Accountability. The fight for accountability has been a long and arduous one. Victims and their families have faced countless obstacles in their quest for justice. The government, despite acknowledging some wrongdoing, has been reluctant to accept full responsibility for its actions. Lawsuits filed by victims have been tied up in court for years. The government has used every legal maneuver at its disposal to delay and obstruct justice. Many victims have died without ever receiving compensation or even an apology for the harm they suffered. Despite the challenges, the fight for accountability continues. Victims' groups and their advocates refuse to let the government sweep its crimes under the rug. They continue to demand justice and recognition for the suffering they endured. Section 9. Breaking the Silence, a Call to Action. The story of the Cold War's secret experiments is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked government power and the importance of transparency and accountability. It is a story that must be told and retold to ensure that such abuses never happen again. We must learn from the mistakes of the past and work to create a future where the rights of all people are respected, regardless of race, religion, or socioeconomic status. We must hold our governments accountable for their actions and demand that they operate with transparency and integrity. The fight for justice is not over. It is a fight that requires the participation of all who believe in a just and equitable society. By raising awareness, supporting victims, and demanding accountability, we can honor the memory of those who suffered and work to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Let us break the silence and shine a light on the dark secrets of the past so that we may build a brighter future for all.